But what I also want to talk about is just looking at the middle class. Because for Warren Buffett to say that even the middle class, that this is the best we've ever done, this is the heyday of America, this is the greatest we've ever been, is hogwash. I would say that the epitome of the American middle class was probably the 1950s. That it started going downhill in the 1960s. But we topped out in the 1950s, and that the standard of living of middle-class American families was higher in the 1950s than it is today. Now, does that mean that I don't think there's been any technological advancements since then? Of course not. There has been. But despite that, the average American middle-class family doesn't live as well. Even with that technology, they don't live as well as Americans did in the 1950s, nor do I believe that they're as happy, right? Yes, they have a few fancy things, but overall, they're in worse shape. I mean, think about it this way. What about the typical woman in a middle-class household today? She's got a job, maybe two. She's working 40 hours a week and outside the home. In the 1950s, middle-class women didn't have to work outside the home, unless, most of them didn't want to. In fact, a lot of the women that are working today don't want to, but they no longer have the choice. Women in the 1950s had the choice not to go to work. Most women today don't have that choice. If they're middle class, they have to work because their husband can't afford to support them. Also, they can't have as many children as they would like. Most women that have one child, maybe two, they prefer to have three or four. They can't afford it. And they can't juggle all those kids and a job at the same time, right? So you have all these women that have to work that didn't have to work before. And of course, I think middle-class women, certainly, upper middle-class women, had more help around the house in the 1950s. More middle-class households had live-in help, live-in housekeepers or part-time housekeepers than they have today. So they didn't spend all their days cooking and cleaning. Maybe if you were married to a blue-collar guy, right, then you did. But if your husband wore a suit to work, chances are you weren't doing all the housework. You had a housekeeper. You spent, your days at the PTA or doing some charity work. Maybe you cooked dinner, or maybe you and your husband went out for dinner. Right? You went out to a nice dinner. You heard music. You went to a show. I mean, most people today, married couples, they don't go out. They don't have nightclubs anymore like they did in the 1950s. I mean, the people that go to clubs now are kids because they don't have jobs. They're in school. They don't have families to support. They don't have work. They go out. They go out to bars and clubs. Married couples, rarely. Yeah, they sit home and watch Netflix because they're too pooped, especially when the husband now, who used to have a wife, he would come home to his house and his wife was there and the meal was maybe ready and the home was all taken care of. Now the guy comes home from work. Maybe he doesn't even beat his wife home. Maybe he gets home first. He's got to start helping with the cooking and taking care of the kids. They're beat. By the time they're finished with dinner, no one has any energy to go out like they used to go out back then. So the entire American way of life has gone down dramatically. Yes, we do have fancier things, but do we have any more enjoyment? I mean, even if you go back when my dad was a kid, growing up during the Depression, they didn't have television yet. He listened to radio, and all of his friends listened to the radio. They listened to the Long Ranger or whatever they listened to. And my dad tells me stories about how much he loved just sitting in a room and staring at a box and listening to that radio. Now, do I think that my dad had any less enjoyment from the radio than my kids today have from television or the internet? I don't think so. Because, you know what you know. I mean, you're used to it. Now, would somebody listen to the radio today, given the fact that there is a television set? Of course not. I mean, if my father had a TV set in the 1930s, he'd have watched that. But that doesn't mean he didn't enjoy what he did have. It's just that he didn't know anything else. So people still enjoyed themselves in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, even though the entertainment by today's standards, when you turned on television, wasn't as good. But I think the number of people who enjoyed live entertainment, was much higher back then than it is today. Most people can't afford it, and so they have to settle for watching a screen. But there is a lot to be said from live theater, live orchestras, concerts, things like that people went to a lot more frequently back then because they actually had more after-tax income, more wealth. And the other big problem is that even though I believe that our standard of living is lower today for middle-class Americans than it was in the 1950s, and I think measurably lower. We can't even afford it because we're borrowing money to maintain this standard of living. I mean, imagine where the typical U.S. household would be if they weren't going into debt. Back in the 1950s, Americans had a higher standard of living, and they can actually afford it. They didn't have to put it on a credit card. They weren't all levered up. As the typical American in the 1950s had a job, and he was supporting his wife, he was saving for his retirement. He was building up. Today, a guy has a job. He can't afford to support his wife. His wife's got a full-time job too. And between the two of them, they can't save anything. And they're going into debt. They've mortgaged up their house. Maybe they have student loans. They got credit card debt. They got loans on their cars. I mean, this is a huge disaster waiting to happen. So if you think the typical American is struggling today, wait till you see what's going to happen when the bill comes due for this gigantic party. Because we were paying cash in the 1950s. We can afford that Leave It to Beaver lifestyle. Now, whatever it is we got now, we can't afford it. Another important point, though, that Buffett is overlooking is the relative difference between the standard of living of Americans versus the rest of the world. Because if you go back to the 1950s, the way the American middle class lived, nobody anywhere else in the world could come anywhere close. I mean, to the extent that you even would call what they had in Europe or South America or Asia a middle class, whatever they had, it paled in comparison to what Americans were living like during that same time period. Right? That is the time period that gave way to the term the ugly American, when you had, a school teacher or a bus driver or, taking a vacation in Europe and, living it up because everybody made so little relative to what we were able to earn. And our dollars went so far. That's where they had the book Europe on $5 a day, because it was very inexpensive for middle-class Americans to travel around Europe because things were so inexpensive. So if you take a look at how much higher our standard of living was in the 1950s relative to the standard of living in other countries, and now compare it today, because today there are many countries in the world where the standard of living is higher than it is in the United States. And there's certainly plenty of countries where it's similar. Maybe it's a little bit lower, a little bit higher, but pretty close. But in 1950, nobody could come anywhere near. It wasn't even a close call. We were so much higher than any place else. And for the fact that so many other nations have caught up and that some of them have even passed us, you have to ask yourself why. How did we blow such a big lead? And the reason we blew it is because we abandoned all the principles that let us get so far ahead in the first place. We went from limited government, free markets, to central planning, central banking, war on poverty. All the things that the government did to supposedly make our lives better backfired and made them worse. And if it wasn't for all the technology that we created, despite all the things that government were doing, imagine how much more difficult life would be if we had today's lack of freedom with 1950s technology. Right? The best, of course, would be if we still had the freedom of the past, but the technology of today. In fact, if we still had the freedom of the past, today's technology would be a lot greater because we would have been even more innovative had we had less government.